It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour MP Sarah Champion, Northern Echo Chief Features writer Chris Lloyd and writer and broadcaster Timandra Harkness. Today,
it's not just that you need some paperwork to send sausages or chicken nuggets to Northern Ireland. There is an outright ban, a prohibition on those goods flowing.
What happens if the UK again delays rules on goods crossing the Irish Sea?
I think it was just a bit frustrating because we thought everything was going back to normal and now it's like, no, it's not.
As Portugal goes amber and Britain's return home, is foreign travel over for the summer? Should you be worried about a central store of data from GP records?
Hardly anyone knows about it. And there are worries about safeguards.
The vast majority of people are strongly on side for the use of their data to improve lives and save lives.
Let's start with the story that British holidaymakers are arriving back and have been overnight from Portugal to beat the 4 a.m. there they are, 4 a.m. deadline as quarantine measures came into place in the early hours this morning. This is because the government has moved Portugal from the green to the amber list of countries. Now, George Eustace, the Environment Secretary, said this morning, I think most people will probably decide this year to holiday at home. So my question to the guest to start us off is, are foreign holidays off this summer? Laura?
I don't think they're off, Joe, but I do think that people have to exercise caution, and I think most people understand that because, coronavirus isn't unique to this country. It's everywhere. We're making good progress through the vaccination programme. Other countries are too. They're a bit behind us. And so I think people are quite reconciled to the fact that if they are going abroad, there's an element of risk there. And the safest option, I'm afraid, is a holiday in Bognor in the rain, probably this year.
Well, let's hope not in the rain. Sarah, do you think foreign travel is off for this summer?
I think unless you have a lot of money behind you, you're retired or you own your own business, I personally wouldn't take the risk. And I feel really frustrated because the people in Portugal now, they did everything right. They thought that they were following all the guidance and then it suddenly gets changed. I mean, my neighbour is over there. She's not seen her elderly dad for over a year and now she's stuck there and doesn't know what to do. And I think the biggest frustration for me is, and we've seen this all the way through, when people have to self-isolate, those that can afford to, it's not that big of an issue. But there's a lot of people in unstable employment at the moment. And for them, I mean, you're just throwing all this back up into the air again. You're getting people who are then meant to be self-isolating who maybe can't afford to without the government support in place. And I just think it's all been really ill thought through.
Well, and as you say, of course, it's not just about holidays abroad. It is about families reuniting or friends reuniting. Let me just show you this tweet from the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He says, vaccinations are now open for over 25s. The vaccine is saving lives, and I'm delighted that over 3/4 of adults have been vaccinated. Join the millions already vaccinated. Each jab brings us hope. This, of course, comes just as we hear this news about holidaymakers having to come back from Portugal if they want to beat that deadline, Timandra.
Well, yes. I think, in some way you could say the problem here is that because we're so far ahead of other countries with vaccination, that, in a sense, we are in a better position than a lot of places where you'd normally go on holiday. But it does seem a bit crazy that the whole point of vaccinating all the adult population is that we are not going to catch it and we're much less likely to pass it on, and therefore we can go back to some kind of normality. But then if you're going to say, well, in spite of having been vaccinated, if you go abroad, you're going to have to come back, you're going to have to self-isolate for 10 days, regardless of however many negative tests you have, then I think a lot of people are going to start saying, well, what's the point of us getting vaccinated if there's very little risk to us personally and it's not going to help restore normal life? I think at some point we have to say, OK, well, as long as you take a test before you come back and maybe another one when you've landed and there's a negative, then we are going to have to assume that vaccination is working and that we can get back to some kind of normality. I know some countries abroad are more there is more of a problem with high rates of infection and new variants, and we probably do need some kind of system that says, this country is really risky, this country is a bit more risky than here, but if you've been vaccinated and you're happy to take the risk that if you come back and you test positive, you have to self-isolate, then that's up to you. But it seems mad that it's more restricted now than it was last summer when we didn't have the vaccines.
Chris, just before I come to you, did you want to say something?
I feel hugely for the travel industry. I mean, they're desperately trying to flog holidays at the moment, but then the government's sort of counteracting them, and there isn't the package of support that was meant to be sector-specific in place.
Right, well, bringing up the travel industry, what about the travel industry here, Chris? Because your paper will no doubt cover lots of seaside resorts, or at least some of them in the UK. They're going to benefit, aren't they, if foreign travel is off limits for many?
Hopefully, yes. And up here, we cover Barnard Castle, which is far better than Bognor in the rain, I can tell you. They've had a fantastic boost to their tourism industry through Dominic Cummings coming for an eye test, and you can come up here and have a Cummings cappuccino and all that sort of thing. But with all of that, there's all sorts of other concerns up here. Talking to hoteliers, they have to go through all sorts of hoops and disinfectants and all that sort of thing, and that's becoming really wearing and on thin margins. That makes it very, very difficult. Then there is an issue about staff in the hospitality sector. I think over in Cumbria, 34% of businesses are really struggling because post-Brexit, there just aren't the staff around. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword, but I do urge people to come up to brilliant Barney to have their eyes tested.
Well, there's a silver lining, obviously, for everyone in this. We're going to move on, actually, because I'm going to show everybody the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which says, Europe threatens sausage trade war. Let's talk to our Northern Ireland correspondent, John Campbell. This is about Northern Ireland, the protocol and trade. John, it's not just about sausages and meats, but why is this such a pressing issue?
Well, Northern Ireland has remained in the EU single market for goods. That's the fundamental plank of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the single market has some quite strict rules on what sort of food products are allowed to enter. And generally, the EU says chilled meat products, such as sausages and mince, should not come into the single market because it views them as being higher risk products. It's more difficult to trace where they have come from. So that should also apply in Northern Ireland under the terms of the protocol. But the UK and the EU negotiated a so-called grace period in December last year, but that grace period is due to expire at the end of this month. So it would mean that short of some further agreement, then there will be a prohibition on those sorts of products, including sausages, entering Northern Ireland from the rest of Great Britain. Now, there should be no great surprise around this because it's something which the UK effectively negotiated twice. But what we have in the Daily Telegraph is the EU in the person of Maroš Šefčovič, the Commission Vice President, saying, do not unilaterally extend that grace period, because if you do, it's only going to make a difficult situation worse, and the EU will feel it has to take further action, because the EU has already started some legal action after the UK government unilaterally extended grace periods applying to other products.
Now, in terms of the sort of action the EU could take, as you say, they've threatened swift and firm action if there was to be another extension around these goods. But what can they actually do?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how swift a resolution would be to any action, because there are certain legal and administrative processes to go through. So there are two sorts of action you can take under the withdrawal agreement, which covers the protocol. That's either infringement proceedings, which would go all the way up to the European Court of Justice. There's also a track there which involves arbitration between the two sides. But ultimately, if you were to get to a position there where there was a finding against the UK and then the UK did not obey that finding, then the Trade and Cooperation Agreement would come into play. There's a pathway to bring that into play, and under that agreement then you could have the position where the EU would impose punitive tariffs on the UK if it continued to breach, in its view, its obligations. But as you can see there, that would be quite a long process. You'd really have to exhaust the different processes under the withdrawal agreement before the TCA would start to come into play.
Well, as you say, John, it doesn't sound very swift. Thank you very much for joining us. Sarah, should the government just extend that grace period to allow those goods, those chilled meats, including sausages, etc., to travel, guarantee it, from GB to NI, Great Britain to Northern Ireland?
I mean, the problem for me is, obviously, I'm worried about sausages and chicken nuggets, but I'm actually worried about the State of the Union. And I have never in my lifetime seen a Prime Minister take a sledgehammer to that quite as much as we're seeing at the moment. We've got Biden saying that if the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland protocols aren't followed, then they're not going to do a trade agreement with us. We've got the EU saying the same thing. So it's not just about extending a grace period. This was always going to come home to roost because the Prime Minister hasn't dealt with the issues around Northern Ireland, and they're suffering the brunt of that.
Laura?
Well, I think it's right to say that the rhetoric has been dialed up somewhat, but I want to stress that there is an unswerving commitment to the Good Friday Agreement. And I think when you look at what Lord Frost has been saying, he's
the negotiator.
He's the negotiator. He says that creative solutions have been made to this issue to the EU and they haven't received a response. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow, which will be a crucial meeting that he's attending. And without saying too much, I think I would say that there have been serious pressure points before in our extraction from the European Union, and I think including working through the first implementation period for the protocol. As I said at the top, the rhetoric has been dialed up, but I do think that there is a way through this. And one of the reasons I think that is that the EU has made some concessions, for example, on medical supplies arriving in Northern Ireland, pet arrivals and pet passports. So the commitment in the protocol is for both sides to use best endeavours. Translation, they must think creatively, and I'm hopeful and actually optimistic that that will be achieved tomorrow.
I mean, the problem is the people of Northern Ireland feel completely let down and abandoned. So, yes, great for pet passports, but I think what we're seeing is they're being driven to join the EU and step away from the Union at the moment, and that is something which I find absolutely appalling. And you're absolutely right, the rhetoric is being stepped up, but all we've had so far over this topic is the sort of the bluster and it being swept down the road, and I'm not seeing the shift there.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you entirely, Sarah. But what I would say actually, it's not bluster or a cavalier attitude. It's the details being worked through in a way, yes, sometimes that has, obviously revealed tensions in the relationship, but I don't think they're insurmountable. And I also don't think it couldn't have been foreseen that when this very unusual kind of dynamic alignment between the two, the EU and the Northern Ireland Protocol, that wouldn't almost inevitably lead to some teething problems and some things to work through in the early days.
I'll come back to the two of you. Tamandra, George Eustace, the Cabinet Secretary, the Environment Secretary, said it was bonkers that we couldn't send sausages to Northern Ireland, or it would be if we couldn't send them. Do you agree?
Well, it is, isn't it? It's like Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and the idea that you can buy a sausage in whatever Stranraer and not buy it, not send it over to Belfast is... makes you nostalgic for the curvy banana disputes, doesn't it? But I really feel for Northern Ireland. I think they're being squeezed between the European Union, which wants to deter other countries from trying to leave and so making it difficult, and I'm afraid the British government, which in the rush to finally get Brexit done after 3 years of shenanigans, rushed through a withdrawal agreement that was full of holes, and this is one of the results of it. And people who said, well, it's an agreement but it's not actually that good and were a bit poo-pooed at the time, I think must now be saying this is the kind of thing. There were all these little potholes left in it and we're now falling into them.
I mean, Chris, it's true, isn't it? The government knew what it was signing up to.
Yes, and it's quite amazing that 6 years after the referendum, we're still having this sort of debate. The Irish border question wasn't really debated during the referendum debate. I remember John Major and Tony Blair went over and stood on the Peace Bridge in Londonderry, but Boris Johnson then kind of dismissed all that and said some sort of miraculous technology would come in and save the day, but that hasn't happened. And this is far more than just sabre rattling over sausages, because it seems to me that we've created an entire entirely new entity here, where we've got a part of the UK that has several toes, at very least, in the EU. And so there's always going to be this border friction. And it really is far more than just sausages. It's really quite profound about identity and belonging. And so this is going to keep coming up time and time again. We should have known, we should have seen it coming. And I think greater minds than mine are going to have to solve it somehow.
Right, Laura, do you accept what Chris has just said?
I don't accept entirely what he's saying, because I think that sort of suggesting that this is a sort of a riddle, that nobody envisaged it, and that
or an
still...
identity, or is now actually sort of provoking an identity crisis.
Well, I think insofar as that answer was referring to some of the trouble on the streets, of course, it is an absolute priority that we take the tension out of this. But, you know, I've said already, I think teething problems were going to happen. And you know, some of the moments in the lead up to our exit from the European Union and negotiating that final agreement, there were moments of extreme tension here politically, internationally. The language that came out of Brussels could be really strong against us, but we got there. So I do think that there are sometimes these flashpoints, and this may be one of them, but with the collective will, I think we can get there. And I think we've already seen some evidence of how we'll do that.
Right. What did you make then of Lord Frost, the negotiator, saying in the Financial Times, we underestimated the impact on goods of the protocol, with some suppliers, for example, in Great Britain, simply not sending their products because of time-consuming paperwork required. Is there now a realisation that it was completely underestimated?
Well, I think you need to contextualise what he wrote in the FT. He didn't sort of say that in isolation. He was talking about sort of the package of products that are being exported to Northern Ireland, and you know, he was talking about inflexibility on the part of the EU.
Well,
that
I was just about to come to that too, but that is one side of it, and he does accept it. But it's true, Sarah, that he then goes on to say it requires a common sense and risk-based approach from the EU as well.
No, I agree. But what I'm frustrated about is this isn't teething troubles. This was inevitable. We knew that this was going to be an issue. We raised this repeatedly as an issue, and we were told that there was going to be, as we've just heard, sort of technological advancements. There was going to be a tunnel, there was going to be a bridge, maybe doves were going to fly the sausages over. And we kind of, just to get it through on the nod, we sort of went along and we trusted that the government had got the details covered. And it's now turning out that they really haven't. And this is a surprise to them, which I find quite shocking.
Well, and as we know, they are meeting this week to talk about it, both sides. We talked yesterday quite a lot about the issue of foreign aid. And this was the government's decision to cut the amount of spending on foreign aid as a percentage of GDP here. MPs had hoped to have a vote on this yesterday. Now, it didn't actually happen. They wanted to vote on an amendment. It was deemed, as we call it in Parliament, out of scope to be selected by the Speaker. But he did say, Lindsay Hoyle, and he was clear that at some point the House should be allowed to have its say. Let's have a listen.
The country needs that this is debated and heard and an effective decision taken. I now put that on the record and hope the government will take up that challenge and give this House its due respect that it deserves. We are the elected members. This House should be taken seriously and the government should be accountable here.
Very passionate there. Laura, what's wrong with MPs having a vote on this?
Well, actually, if you look at the legislation that sets out the 0.7%, it actually gives the Chancellor the right to adjust that percentage in this when there is sort of economic or fiscal pressure. So he's not doing anything unlawful. It's within the scope of the legislation to adjust the percentage.
It was an election promise, though, wasn't it? Manifesto promise at 0.7%.
But look, I think, you know, the government has set out its position on this. I've been in the chamber for a couple of sessions, so it's not that there's been no accountability on it. The position is that having spent 407 billion on the COVID response, which was, you know, unprecedented for any year, we have to put the sort of interests of the British people first, and all the other things that we're being asked to spend, catch-up schooling and the NHS and the vaccine rollout. And so I have heard the Chancellor more than once, and he does get asked about this, to confirm that it's a temporary cut. And I think that is probably the most important detail in this.
It's a temporary cut. We don't know exactly how long, it's true, Sarah, but the government has said it's temporary. And also the vote couldn't happen yesterday because of the sort of clear rules around Parliament and procedures. The Speaker was right not to bend those rules.
The Speaker, I am told, had a lot of pressure around him to make the decision that he made. My understanding was that both lawyers and the clerks had drafted that amendment, and the fact that it was initially accepted, to my mind, means that it is lawful. What isn't necessarily lawful is the Chancellor's decision to state he was dropping from 0.7% to 0.5% of our GNI. There is a lot of lawyer hours going into proving that he is being unlawful on that. What frustrates me, though, is within the existing legislation, when our economy drops, so does our foreign aid money. Our foreign aid money isn't only about humanitarian support, it's also about our international standing. It buys us a seat at every table. It's about our security, because unstable nations, which our funding goes to prop up the governments, that creates a direct threat to our country. It's our international trade deals. You know, if we have a good relationship with a country, they're more likely to trade with us. So post-Brexit, all of the things that concern all of the British population, not least health in a global pandemic, they all tie down to our spending on foreign aid. So to get rid of that so dramatically, drop it by a third at this moment in time, is really damaging to us internationally.
But I don't disagree with anything that Sarah just said, except for the last bit. I completely agree on the importance of foreign aid, but I think there are two things that have been missed a bit. The most important crisis facing the world at the moment is coronavirus, and our purchasing of AstraZeneca means that we can be the biggest exporter of AstraZeneca vaccination at cost price to developing countries. That's not part of international aid, but that will make, I think, more difference than any aid that we deliver this year. And the second point that sometimes I think gets a bit swamped with all the talk about the kind of millions and billions is that I think there is a case for better focused aid, and in fact I think a lot of that money could be used in a more targeted and efficient way to to support some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and we don't necessarily allow that into the debates we have in Parliament because we get so caught up on figures.
I think what we need to see is a clear strategy from this government, and we're not getting that at all. So we don't even know where the money that they have ring-fenced is going to be spent at the moment. We don't know what the outcomes are that they're looking to achieve, because every priority that they set, for example, girls' education, they then cut funding to girls' education internationally. Security, they've taken $4 billion away from aid, they've given $4 billion to defence. Now, I don't know about you, but poverty, lack of economic potential, and as I said, unstable governments are a real driver for security concerns in this country. They're not going to be addressed by getting more nuclear bombs. They're going to be addressed by dealing with them at source and creating full tummies and future for people.
And I agree with you again, Sarah, but what I would say is actually a strong defence force it encourages and stimulates our ability to work multilaterally through NATO and so on as a peacekeeping force in war zones, which again can restore stability to countries where people otherwise might be desperate and living in extreme circumstances for longer. And on girls' education, I think I'm right in saying that the 400 million that's committed to that is ring-fenced, and you hear it again and again. Everyone from the Foreign Secretary to the Prime Minister at the dispatch box, reinforce that is a commitment to this government.
That's a drop of 25%, though, from what they were previously doing.
We're going to leave it there because we talked about this a lot yesterday too, and I want to draw everyone's attention to this story, which actually has slightly changed since we've come on air. But first of all, let's start with the Daily Mirror headline, which is "Your NHS data set to be shared from June the 23rd as campaigners threaten court fight." Now, this is the government pressing ahead with the creation of a central NHS database of information from GP records. Now, that date is being extended. We just heard it in the House of Commons from the Minister concerned. So the NHS had wanted to delay this until September, and that is, in fact, what's happening. Let's have a little listen.
We will proceed with the important programme, but we will take some extra time as we have conversed with stakeholders over the past couple of days. The implementation date will now be on the 1st of September, and we will use this time to talk to patients, doctors, health charities and others to strengthen the plan, build a trusted research environment and ensure that data is accessed securely.
All right, well, there is a win, a victory, of course, for those who did want an extension to the date. It does mean that you will have longer, I presume, than June the 23rd to opt out if you want to. Let's talk to Caroline Cake, Chief Executive Officer of Health Data Research UK, who campaigned to make health data available to researchers. Just first of all, your reaction to the fact that the Minister has just announced they are now going to extend the date until the 1st of September. Is that something you welcome?
We certainly welcome the greater engagement of public and better communications around it. So I think if that delay of the 1st helps with that, I think, yes, certainly would be welcomed.
Now, let's talk about the concerns that have been raised about the data being misused potentially by third parties. Are people right to be worried about that, Caroline?
I mean, the data is incredibly carefully managed, and access to the data is by no means a free-for-all and anyone can access it. You have to go through extremely rigorous processes, access panels to make sure that the use is in the public interest. So, no, I think the concerns have been considerably kind of escalated than what the actual purposes are. And in the process of doing that, what we've lost is the story about the enormous benefits that come from using data, which we've seen extensively through the COVID period, be it from treatment discoveries to vaccines, to impacts of vaccines, to impacts of people who are vulnerable. The data is just absolutely valuable and essential that we're all represented within it. So I think really want to make the case that it is in all of our interests to be represented in this data, and the groups who aren't represented, you're not going to get the valuable research done on people like you if you're not included in the data.
Right, and this it would be data from GPs as such. What could it be used for? I mean, you talk there literally about saving lives.
Yes, it's really life-saving activities. And the examples I gave there around COVID, so be it around finding clinical trials, discovering people suitable for clinical trials, or vaccines, or impacts on different groups. But it's also much more than that. So going beyond COVID, I want the same level of discoveries happening in dementia, in cardiovascular disease, in cancers, for people with mental health, I mean, for people living with rare diseases. This data is absolutely essential for all of us and for all of our lives.
Caroline, thank you very much. But stay with us and listen to the discussion. Timandra, you're pleased by this postponement, certainly. But listening to Caroline, I mean, it does sound incredibly important from a medical research perspective.
Oh, yes, it is very important. And I mean, I would encourage everybody to donate their medical data in the same way as, you know, you might give blood or ask your organs to be donated after your death, because we can all collectively benefit from it as a society and often as individuals. So I'm a great believer in using health data for research. And in fact, I've voluntarily signed up for various symptom tracking apps to give out a lot of personal information so it can be used. I think the problem with this is that the stealthy way in which the government were trying to bring it in, or NHS Digital were trying to bring it in, by making it really, really complicated to opt out if you did want to opt out. You actually had to print out a form, which I have done, all ready to do my opt-out for today's news. You had to print out a form and take it to your GP. This has been very little publicised, and even if you go to some of the NHS websites to find out more, they say, oh, there's no deadline and you can just opt out online, which is true, except that means your data is only withdrawn from the scheme after that date. So it's been done in rather a sneaky way, which I think is a pity, because it's perfectly possible to do this in a way that reassures people that there's a trustworthy system. I'm incredibly pleased to hear that there's going to be what's called a trusted research environment, and I hope this means that it's literally the same trusted research environment that already exists, which is a system where you can have a pool of data, and instead of just handing it over wholesale to other researchers, you can say, well, we have the pool of data here. What questions do you want to ask? We can give you access just to ask your specific questions and get the answers you need and take them away. And it's maximally protected and maximally private. And if that's the system that's going to be used, why don't they just come out and tell everybody, say, this is a very secure system. These are the uses your data will be put to. Please say yes. Please don't opt out. If you do want to opt out, here's an incredibly straightforward system, and be completely open about it. Because otherwise, you look like you're doing something underhand. Why should people trust you?
I'll get Laura to respond to those comments. But Chris, you've been nodding away while Timandra has been speaking. Do you think your readers know all about this?
No, not at all, not at all. I like to think I'm fairly well informed, but the first I became aware of it was on my news feed when people on the left of centre were saying, this is terrible, it's being snuck in, and they're setting off the various things from the NHS, and therefore you must opt out. And then almost immediately after that, the right wing on my news feed started saying, this is Big Brother taking all of your data, and therefore you must opt out for those reasons as well. So by not explaining it, and I mean, it is quite bizarre that the Health Secretary hasn't kind of made some form of a statement about it. It's not as if he's not been on TV much recently. By kind of creating this vacuum, all these people are therefore able to come in and create a cloud of suspicion over it, whereas really there is probably a middle line here where this is really valuable. I think it's been going on for about 10 years, or a version of it under the GP extraction service, and it can have real benefits. But instead of really selling it positively, a cloud of suspicion has been created around it.
Right, well, you've managed to unify, or the government's managed to unify, Laura, both sides of the political spectrum. What's going on here? Why the accusations of being sneaky and untrustworthy? You haven't gone about this the right way.
I don't recognise those accusations. I mean, at the
but everyone seems to be, when I say everyone, I mean Timandra, certainly Chris so far, and Sarah will do too.
I'm not privy to any of the discussions in government, but the first time I heard it raised in Parliament was yesterday, and then today from your piece there's been an extension of time, which suggests that it wasn't, you know, a kind of, you know, unwavering commitment to the 23rd of June. I think one of the points that is worth bearing in mind, though, is that your data is held on an anonymised basis, so it is just the health data, not the personal information that people are going to be handing over. And I do, you know, I do accept that people own their own data and they have sensitivities around it. But if we want to design and build the systems and structures, you know, and address some of the fundamental health inequalities that raise their heads again and again and again, this is the way to do it.
Right, I'll come to you so in a minute. You're shaking your head. Isn't that true, though, Timandra? It is anonymised, isn't it? The system won't include people's names, addresses.
No, it's pseudonymised and encrypted, which I would hope would happen automatically as soon as you're sharing sensitive data. It's pseudonymised, which means you can't look at the database and read your name or your NHS number, but there is an identifying number so that it could be traced back to you if necessary, because that's kind of the value of the NHS database is incredibly valuable because it covers everybody and goes through your whole life. But your GP practice includes not just like your blood pressure and the drugs you're on. It includes things like when you went and talked to your GP about being depressed, about whether your partner was hitting you, whether you've had a termination, all sorts of really personal things that could really affect your life if in all sorts of ways. And pseudonymization is not anonymization. It's very easy to re-identify you if somebody wanted to. This is not a reason to not share your data for research purposes, but it is a reason to want to know that it's going to be quite carefully controlled and that access will only be given to people who do research on public good, whether they're private organisations or public.
I know you all want to come in, but I just want to bring Caroline in, who I think is still there and has been listening to this. Caroline, what do you want to say in response to this issue?
A couple of things. So a very good point made by Timandra on trusted research environments. That's an absolute key part to this and done in a secure way. However, I would slightly say a counter to what Timandra was saying there in terms of anybody could de-identify it. It can only be identify people from the pseudonymisation. It can only be done by NHS Digital through extremely careful control processes for extremely narrow circumstances. So it is not a case that you could be identified readily through that route.
Right. Are you reassured by that, Sarah? Because one of the other things when I was reading about this, and which Caroline, I think, would attest to, is that the data from a GP surgery, different to hospital data, could actually give all sorts of interesting research around chronic illnesses, which would help then in terms of treatment. I
mean, Timandra's points about sharing medical data when it's your choice, I fully support. But this freaks me out.
Does it?
Oh, completely. One, that we didn't know anything about it and it's our data. Two, Matt Hancock does not have a good track record when it comes to these digital geeky projects that he loves. But three, who is actually getting access to this? We're talking about, I'm assuming, Big Pharma, who are doing most of the research. Yeah. And then why is it that my data protection applies to one government department but not another? And then the very practical level, GPs are independent businesses. They don't always use the same system as the NHS. Different NHS foundation trusts have different systems. So on a sheer practical practical point of view, how is this actually going to happen? How is it going to be stored? And how is it going to be protected?
But Sarah, would you accept that taking health service into the 21st century in a meaningful way is a far more effective thing to do if we do it by locating data centrally and working out what themes and trends and symptoms and disparities we're seeing so that we can design a system fit for the future? And if we still, with everybody just having a pack of notes at the GP, we're still going to be offering a second-class, historic, old-fashioned health system that just isn't good enough.
When it's someone's choice and they're able to make an informed decision, yes. But let me give you a practical example. I used to run a children's hospice before doing this job, and we were trying to do exactly that, get all of the children's data in an electronic form so we could share it with GPs, with health workers, with hospitals. They were all, and this is a small area, they were all on a different system, and it was absolutely impossible to do it. So I think once you start sort of picking down into the practicalities of doing this, it's going to be incredibly difficult. But it's also the fact that why hasn't this been transparent up front if it's so good? Why is it that we potentially only had 20 days had the minister not rolled back on this?
Well, look, I mean, that's an issue that's being corrected, but I think on this whole kind of...
But it is, just to come back to it, because, I mean, there does seem to be unanimity here that people really didn't know enough about it or anything about it, it seems. And that's obviously why the government's decided to postpone it.
I think you're right,
but why not? But why not? I mean, would this not be something they want to communicate?
Well, I think it absolutely is something they want to communicate, and I don't think they would like the charge that, that they were trying to hide this, because they want as many people as possible to come forward and do it, and to do so willingly, and they want there to be kind of public confidence and public buy-in. So I'm sure that's the reason, or one of the reasons, why they've extended time.
Final point, Jo.
Yes.
Doesn't the NHS have enough on its hands at the moment? Without having this layered on top of them.
This is NHS Digital, so I suppose they are providing
but they're still going to have to work
functionality
with the frontline health providers to implement this at a time when a report's come out today saying that they are so short-staffed. There's so much PTSD going on, and not to mention the massive waiting list that we've now got. And to do this now just seems really short-sighted.
Caroline, can I get your response to that? Is it important enough to do at this critical juncture?
Absolutely essential, yes. It's critical that we're getting data, and the data is being done by a wide group of researchers who are working on urgent healthcare issues right now for COVID and for beyond COVID. So delays to this, in terms of delays to get public engagement, very positive, but the research needs to happen and needs to happen now.
Caroline Cake, thank you very much for joining us. Let's just show everybody the front page of the Northern Echo, Chris's paper. It comes actually today because there's been an announcement by the Housing and Communities and Local Government Department. Further 26 towns will share £610 million of funding, otherwise known as the Towns Fund. The headline we were looking at is Bright Future for the High Street, Government to inject millions into high streets in the North East. Chris, this announcement has been covered on your front page and many other papers today. Do you think it'll make a meaningful difference to the communities you cover?
Well, it will begin to make a meaningful difference, I think. People up here in what was the Red Wall area have voted for Boris Johnson for a number of different reasons, but one of them was the appeal of the levelling up slogan. And it kind of reassured them. It told them that he was on their side and that it kind of played to their prejudices that they'd been forgotten about and left behind and overlooked. So that's very, very good. But he's been kind of living up here almost in the run-up to the general, to the local elections. I had five chances to meet him in 2 months. Amazing. And I kept bothering him over how do you actually prove that levelling up is being effective. Like the life expectancy in the North East is 3 years less than it is in London. Can we judge him on that? Transport infrastructure spending, extraordinary. 2014. London got £2,556 per head spent on transport. The North East got £5 and a penny. So how do you address that discrepancy? And will levelling up do it? And he wasn't really able to answer how we would judge levelling up. But now we're beginning to see some money coming in specifically to try and improve town centres, which are the hub of many local communities. And so perhaps we can begin to judge whether levelling up really does exist or whether it's just a fantastic slogan through this.
Well, I mean, Laura, of the 26 towns I mentioned that benefit from this latest funding announcement, we've heard others before, only 4 are not held by the Conservatives. In March, the Chancellor was forced to deny this was simply pork barrel politics. Surely that's just what it is.
I don't think it's pork barrel politics, I think, as Chris has just said, there are constituencies that have gone Conservative for the first time on the promise of levelling up, and they've gone Conservative a bit like Hartlepool, I think, which is one of the beneficiaries, because the people there were pretty explicit about the fact that they felt forgotten and overlooked and let down. And, you know, most people's experience of politics isn't really what they see in Westminster, if indeed they ever really watch it on the news. It's about walking around the place that they live and knowing whether they feel kind of pride or whether things are improving or whether they're falling to bits. And I think actually the Towns Fund is one of the most important kind of injections you can give to some of these forgotten places to help them to restore the buildings that they love and treasure their heritage, and kind of and one of the important bricks in the wall towards properly levelling up the country, instead of having towns that feel kind of forgotten dumps that nobody cares about. And that has an effect on the psyche of the people who live there.
Sarah? I mean, your constituency is receiving £36 million, just over, from the fund.
And I got that announcement just before coming on this programme, which shows the power
so you must welcome that.
It's wonderful.
I wish I had that power.
I'm hugely grateful. But let's put it in some context. Over the last 2 years, Rotherham Council has been cut £30 million by this government. Over the last 10 years, it's £130 million that it's cut from its budget. And when you look at all of the projects, particularly the first round, they were going to Tory marginal seats, not the areas that had the deepest deprivation. And yes, it's lovely to get £36 million, and our town centre really, really needs it. But there's a much bigger picture at play here. You know, we also need youth workers, we need proper jobs, we need real investment. And it's lovely to get some sweeties, but that's not enough. And I don't think that people are going to see it as sort of the panacea for all of the problems that we've had over the last 10 years.
Timandra, do you have a problem with this money going to mainly Conservative constituencies, as it turns out?
Not particularly. I think it's more a matter of, is it going to go to the places where it's going to make a difference? And is that amount of money going to make a difference? You know, 83 million sounds like a big amount for an individual, but I don't. I mean, as Sarah just said, across a town, it's really not that much money. The question is, what's going to happen to it? Is it going to make a difference? Transport seems to be a massive issue, and I'm well aware, as soon as you leave London, public transport is lousy and almost non-existent. And with the current push against people driving private vehicles, I am thinking, well, how are people meant to get around if they live in small towns? How are they meant to get to work if there is work? How are they meant to travel and see their family and so on? So maybe Boris, who loves big infrastructure projects, maybe he can crack out some wonderful modern integrated transport system that will cover the whole of Britain outside London.
OK, well, there's an ambition. Chris, how do you like the sound of that?
Fantastic. It is, of course, despicable and deplorable if it really is pork barrel politics. But from our point of view up here, I think it is welcome that at long last somebody in that far distant place called London has realised that there are towns like Bishop Auckland, like Hartlepool, like Redcar, who have felt completely disconnected from London, even from Brussels as part of the Brexit vote. And all of a sudden, they are being looked at and concentrated upon, and although it's only a few baubles and a few pennies, that money can be spent locally, and it can increase the pride in these towns as well. So we'd obviously like loads more money, but it's a start and it's good.
Right, real investment Sarah talked about, Laura, but in fact the Government's Education Recovery Commission, as you know, resigned last week after ministers allocated only £1.4 billion for catch-up plans in schools. Wouldn't that be real investment if they put more money into education in the areas that Chris is talking about?
Well, I mean, education, of course, is going to be one of the areas. I mean, one of the things that they are doing in those sorts of areas is the Lifetime Skills Guarantee, which gives people who didn't have a university or college education the chance to retrain and reskill and take out a student loan to do it at any point in their adult life. And I think that is probably the most important education announcement that's going to affect some of those, northern towns. And just want to come back on that very briefly on that transport point. I think it's a very good point and a very important point, actually, that some of those places are inaccessible and getting around is far more difficult. That would never have been paid for out of the Towns Fund, though. That was a discrete funding to improve town centres. But I think there are huge plans in place for transport in those areas too.
We haven't heard them yet, though. We couldn't get a timing from the Minister when he was last on.
You're absolutely right to raise education. I mean, there is very, very clear evidence that in areas of deprivation, those children are just going to fall into a black hole for the rest of their lives. And this pains me deeply. If you're able to have a private tutor, if you're able to have the internet, then those children aren't going to suffer as much, but we're talking £50 per child for a tutor. It's a drop in the ocean.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of my guests, and I will be back tomorrow at 11:15.